To Mr. Michael Swain. Thank you for joining us in studio, sir.
Oh, good morning, Jonathan. Always good to be on Breakfast with Friends.
It's always good to have you, Michael. Always, always good. So in the way of a little bit of an introduction, the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, commonly known just as the Hate Speech Bill, is again back on the table. And I feel like we've been talking about it for years, but this time it's on the table before the National Council of Provinces, or NCOP. And we've now got our last opportunity to comment as the public. Before we get into what the bill is all about, just for those who are already on par with us, they know, they've read up, they've been listening to all the interviews. So what is the deadline, and why do we have to make our voices thick again?
Well, the deadline is now the 22nd, which is Monday of May. So we don't have long. And the reason why we have to comment again is because the assumption is that when you commented the last two times, because we commented when it was from the Department of Justice, and then we commented when it was in front of the National Assembly, that those comments were taken into account. And therefore that this now current version of the bill, because it changes every time, is now something that has taken all our comments into account. And of course, if we don't comment, then the assumption is that we're very happy with the outcome. And assuming it gets passed with very few comments, then government would argue, well, the people had their chance to say if they didn't like it or not. Yeah. And obviously they liked it because not many people have commented. Now, bear in mind, the first time 70,000 people commented. The second time, 100,000 people commented. When I checked the counter yesterday, it was on 8,000.
Okay.
So we have to be really quick to wake up because let me tell you, this bill has gone in the wrong direction, not the right direction.
Oh, really? So even though there have been all the comments and all the feedback given,
they have not been taken into account. In fact, if anything, it's gone in a different direction. So, for instance, the first time it came out, the first offense sentence was up to 3 years in jail, which we said was ridiculous for something that you might say would put you in jail for 3 years. And by the way, we haven't had this type of legislation since pre-1994.
Yeah.
And criminalizing hate speech, according to international treaties, is the last thing that one should ever do. Because obviously, the more you shut down speech, particularly if you criminalize it, which is obviously a severe sanction, the less free speech you have. And free speech is fundamental to democracy. So instead of actually taking the public's views into account, they've actually upped the ante. They've doubled down in a sense. In fact, they've more than doubled down, because the first offense for what would be the new crime under this bill of hate speech will be up to 8 years in jail. 8 years in jail.
For simply saying something that could be construed as hate speech.
Precisely.
Yo. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, have we got your attention? 8 years imprisonment is what's on the line here. This is about the hate speech bill. So now let's take it back, because to be clear, none of us in this studio, none of us within CCFM advocate or are saying hate speech is okay.
Of course not.
We're not saying that. So what is the nitty-gritty? What is the issue at hand when it comes to this bill and how it's been modified? What are the things that potentially could trip up pastors, church leaders, radio presenters?
Well, the first thing you have to do when you think about hate speech is, how do you define hate speech? Because as we say, the devil's always in the details. Yeah. And our Constitution is very narrow in terms of what it defines as hate speech. So it has to be an advocacy to hatred with an incitement to do harm, typically violent harm. So typical hate speech would be kill the farmer, kill the Boer. Who do we want you to hate? Farmers. What do we want you to do to them? Kill them.
Yeah.
The problem is that when you start to widen the definition and you start to add very loose terminology around it, of course, it becomes much easier to be caught then in the net of hate speech. And this bill is very wide in its definition. So, for example, when it talks about harm, it talks about substantial harm. So it's not severe harm, or, you don't have to use elements which you do, of course, if and under a civil action for hate speech, of detestation or vilification. It's just substantial harm. And then the categories of harm include emotional harm.
What?
So in other words, you could say something which substantially emotionally harms someone, and that is the equivalent of a crime of hate speech. Now, what is substantial emotional harm? Is it, you badly hurt my feelings, I'm very, very offended? In other words, it's not high, the bar. It's very low, the bar.
It is very low.
And of course, one of the problems with that is that it means that you don't actually really know when you have committed a crime of hate speech or not. The other problem with it, of course, is that they've now expanded the categories that you can actually be caught in this net. So the categories under the Constitution are very few. There's only 4 categories.
Okay.
Under the hate speech bill, I've lost track. It's probably more than 14 or 15, including new categories, like, for example, gender ideology, sexuality, which, of course, as we know, have very broad definitions, which were never thought of 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So that means that if you substantially hurt somebody, harm somebody, offend somebody on the basis of their, say, sexual orientation or their gender identity or what have you, that could potentially mean that you would be arrested and put in jail. And another thing I think to say is that it doesn't have to be something that you say in public. It also catches you in private. So you could be literally having a private conversation with somebody that somebody else overhears or maybe records, and that would be enough if somebody then took that forward. There doesn't even have to be an actual victim in this instance. So it's just that could somebody, if they'd listened to what you said or saw what you expressed, actually experience substantial emotional harm, their feelings would be very, very hurt. That would put you in jail.
Sure.
Potentially.
Now, I remember from the very first time when we spoke about this bill, you kept on saying, we don't need this bill. Just run us by that quickly, because, we live in a society, we live in a world that has changed, and we live in a place where racism and bigotry and all those things still exist. But you're saying we don't need the bill. Why would you say that?
Well, one of the big things that the Department of Justice are pushing this for is because of racism, because there's so much racist speech in this country. I'm not sure if that's strictly accurate, but that's their major motivation for it. That's the card that they continue to play. And we have already got 2 very effective ways of combating hate speech already. PAPUDA, which is known as the Equality Act, that has clause which basically the Constitutional Court addressed in the Kulani case. You might remember that case was a man who really said some very, very vilifying, horrible things about people from the LGBT community.
Yeah.
And they said that that was hate speech, and they defined hate speech, but they defined it narrowly. In other words, you have to really make some very strong detestations, vilification. I mean, they were very strong about how almost horrible your speech had to be and how insightful it had to be to try and get other people to really take some negative form of action. That's PAPUDA. Now, if you get found guilty, if you like, if you lose your case under PAPUDA, then you're going to pay a civil sanction. So you're going to pay a fine, you're going to be made to make an apology, you might have to do community service or something like that. It is actually easier under the hate speech bill to be sent to jail for 8 years than it is under PAPUDA to be forced to make an apology or to pay a fine. So the other thing we have is we have a common law crime called crime in injuria. And that was used very effectively, for example, against Penny Sparrow, Vicky Momberg, who, as you might recall, made very strong racist remarks.
Yeah.
And they were sentenced. They had a criminal sentence for that. So we have these sanctions already. And that's the big question. Why do we need something that is so broad and potentially so penal? Because 8 years in jail is a long time.
It is.
That we now need some new law, which, again, we haven't had this type of law on our statute books since pre-1994. It's very concerning.
It's very concerning. So how do people go about making their voices heard? How do they ensure that, that, again, there's a massive response?
Well, we have to, again, as you say, make our voices heard. And we always say the more people who speak up, the louder the voice becomes. And this is a numbers game. And so the best way is to go to the forsa.org.za website, and right on the homepage, you're going to see a slider, and you have a little link there which says have your say, and you click that. It takes you to the Dear SA platform. We've teamed up with Dear SA again because we know that that platform is reliable. We know that every submission goes straight to in this case, the NCOP. So we want to encourage everybody to do that. Organizations, if you then wait for the second image on our home page to appear, there's a download. You can download an organizational pro forma, if you like. You can copy and paste it and put it on your letterhead and send it in. So all the details are there. All the addresses are there.
Fantastic. And obviously, people can go to your YouTube channel, can go to Facebook to find more
Yes.
information.
Now, we have a lot of information on our YouTube channel. In fact, I've broken it up into 8 big problems, and you can watch each of those little videos. They're about 1.5 minutes long, or there's a 4-minute or 3.5-minute video. And we also want to encourage pastors to play them in their churches as well. Because really on Sundays, this is the time when we need to be mobilizing, because we need literally a moment, and it literally takes you 2 minutes, not even 2 minutes, to actually make your submission. And we need a moment where we are aware and we now really feel this potential. This is our last opportunity. As I say, if we don't speak up on this occasion, the government will take the view that we're actually now happy with the outcome. And when a bill comes into law, and they're going to fast track this, by the way. So the timetable that we understand is by the end of June, they want it to have passed the NCOP. And then the president, we believe, is willing to sign it into law in about August.
Sure.
So literally in sort of 3-4 months' time, this will be in force and enforceable. And the only way you can ever overturn such a bill is if you then challenge it potentially in the Constitutional Court.
Which is massively expensive.
Very expensive and very timely or time-consuming. So, for example, there was an unlawful and illegal definition of hate speech in the Equality Act in Papuda. Finally, the court considered it in the Kwalani case, which was in 2021, and they overturned it. And they said, look, this definition of hate speech is too broad, it's unlawful, and now we're going to change it. But it had been enforced and enforceable for 21 years. So we have to understand that if we don't raise our voices now, we are going to live with something which literally, for something that you say or express, and you can think of the conservative expressions that you might make as a Christian, because most of what the Bible says about things like sex, sexuality, gender, marriage, I mean, pick a subject, is not in keeping with today's politically correct world. That can be very offensive to people. I mean, I was on a phone call the other day, and I made what I thought was a very mild, minor comment, and I was very much given pushback for that because it was triggering, because the person, on the conversation said, I am not an ideology. And I said, well, I'm never saying you are an ideology. I'm just saying that what you believe, because you believe something that isn't scientifically based, is an ideology. And we certainly can't be teaching ideology to little children in pre-primary schools.
Yeah.
But they were very, very upset with me. And that could potentially be sufficient for me to be arrested and put in jail for 8.5 years or for 8 years.
Sure.
So we need to wake up. You know, often we sit and we think, how on earth did that happen? Well, in this instance, the only way that this is going to happen is because if people will have been basically given the opportunity to speak and not taken it.
That's
and
it.
then we're going to live with the consequences.
That's it. So it's here and now, ladies and gentlemen. This is the moment. You may have submitted in the past. That's great. Thank you. But now we need you to resubmit because the bill has been changed. There have been modifications and amendments and so forth made. This bill is now in front of the NCOP, and we need to make our voices heard. Every single person needs to do so. Please go and find out the details simply by going to 4sa.org.za or going to Dear South Africa. So important.
Yeah, and the one other thing is that we did, people might remember, get an exemption clause for bona fide religious expression put into the bill. But the problem with that clause is that it is what they call circular. So in other words, it says you will be exempted from committing hate speech under this bill as long as you haven't said something that is hate speech in terms of this bill.
Oh, whoa.
So
yeah,
really,
that is very circular.
It's not a defense at all. And it's certainly not adequate. And we have said time and time again, everybody has said in the last 2 rounds of submissions, we need to strengthen that clause so that it does give legitimate protection to bona fide, legitimate religious expression, which is entitled under the Constitution, under Section 15. So the question is, why isn't government listening to this? Because they're definitely not.
Yeah.
And we must speak up because, as we say, we do not see, and we've checked this out with teams of lawyers, that the defense, if you like, that's put into the bill for legitimate religious expression is adequate. It's not. And again, if we don't speak up now, we're going to live with the consequences.
Michael Swain, Executive Director for Freedom of Religion South Africa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan.